All right, so in this video, we're going to finish up by looking at the respiratory zone structures of the bronchi and then moving on to the lungs, looking first at this area called the respiratory membrane, which is part of the respiratory zone. All right, so respiratory zone structures. The respiratory zone begins where these terminal bronchioles feed into, so you see here, terminal bronchioles, part of the conducting zone, and then you get into these respiratory bronchioles, which then feed into these tiny little sacs called alveoli. They're like little bundles, and these little alveoli are basically where gas exchange occur. The lungs are basically composed of these alveoli. Approximately 300 million alveoli make up most of the volumes of the lung, and this is where the gas exchange is going to be occurring. Here you see a picture of the alveoli. You can see the little pores where the gases come in to, and basically, if we get a better picture here, here we go. Yeah, there's that too. All right, so you can see here wrapped around each one of these alveoli are tiny little veins and arteries, tiny little capillaries where the gas exchange is going to be occurring. The barrier, basically, this is a single cell membrane here, and there's these capillaries, remember, are very small, microscopic as well. And so this allows for gas exchange to occur just by simple diffusion. Uh, there's just the passage of gas. There doesn't need to be any specialized tubes or anything, but just between those two cells, gas will go from an area of high concentration to low. And so oxygen and CO2 will be exchanged there. A couple other things here. Basically mentioned they're just a thin layer of cells, and the purpose of another purpose of the alveoli is they equalize pressure throughout the lung, and they can also provide alternate routes. As if there's blockages in one section, then it can go through another section. You can see how they're all interconnected there. And there are also macrophages that will travel all throughout the surface of the alveoli, and they're keeping the surface of the alveoli sterile, in order to, you don't want to have any infection in your lungs. One interesting thing is that about 2 million dead macrophages per hour are carried up to the throat and swallowed, uh, as a result of their work to keep your lungs clean. So that's a good thing. Lots of macrophages on the front line doing work for you. All right, so let's talk about lungs. The lungs occupy most of the thoracic cavity here, as you can see, and then there's this area between the two lungs called the mediastinum, and there you see mediastinum. It's where the heart and trachea and the thymus is, all that business there. And so here's the right and left lungs. The left lung is separated into two lobes here, as you can see, and there's also this little notch here for the heart to go into in the lung. And the right lung is separated into three lobes: superior, inferior, and middle lobes. And the lungs, again, are mostly composed of alveoli, and there's the rest is basically just elastic connective tissue, and this makes the lungs very elastic and spongy, and so that they can be stretched out, and so that then they can also, more importantly, return to that same position, and so the lungs never get too stretched out, but they're constantly filling up and then exhaling back out, going back to the previous position. So here's a picture, like you can see what this is right here. They're basically cut this guy's shoulders off and look down the tube, and you can see how much of the lung is filled up there. And then we'll look at these structures called the pleurae, which the pleurae is just a fancy word for um, these sacs that contain the lungs, and there are two of them. Basically, there are membranes that divide the thoracic cavity into these two compartments, and then into the mediastinum as well, which you see right here. There is the parietal pleura, and let's see the parietal pleura here, and you can see it's this red one. It's an outside, and then the visceral pleura, which is goes along the external surface of the lung. And so the parietal pleura is contacting the ribs and the intercostals, whereas the visceral pleura is actually contacting the lung. And there's some fluid that exists between these two pleura that lubricates them and decreases the surface tension between them. And this allows the lungs to expand and contract without much problem, without any issues. If you have friction between those two pleura, then what can happen is you can actually have some trouble breathing. Every single breath hurts because of the friction between those those two sacs. There's a disorder called pleurisy, which is this inflammation of those pleura, and that can lead to something as serious as pneumonia, basically where something that has become inflamed in there and the surface of those pleura has become rough, and they'll rub against each other and then they'll fill with fluid, and this can cause pneumonia.